Welcome to Books in Five, where we interview the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. We'll be asking the author 5 questions, and they will have 5 minutes to answer each one. I'm very excited about my guests today, as they have written an excellent new book explaining the rise of far-right terrorism in America. Bruce and Jacob, thank you so much for being our guests on Books in Five. Please introduce yourselves, the title of your book, and where you are joining us from today.
Hi, I'm Bruce Hoffman, and I'm the Senior Fellow for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security at the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as a professor at Georgetown University, and I'm based in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, also an adjunct professor at Georgetown and at DeSales University, coming to you from Washington, D.C. And the title of our book is God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America.
Great. Let's begin with our first question. Your book explores the decades-long history of far-right extremism and violence in America. What are the underlying dynamics that have been drawing people into this worldview?
Well, it's really a melange of things. I mean, certainly it begins with racism, and of course, one can trace that back throughout American history, but particularly in the period before, during, and unfortunately after the Civil War. But the book's main thrust is really the trajectory that Jacob and I identify as really crystallizing in the early 1980s. And that's when racism, anti-Semitism, this wealth of conspiracy theories, even back then in an era before social media, were almost superseded by a profound animus or hostility to the US government and the desire to overthrow the government, where sedition became front and center, one of the motivations. And we trace that trajectory, of course, to the events that unfolded at the United States Capitol on January 6th, 2021.
Well, it's important to note, as Bruce alluded to, this is a long-standing threat in American history. Some of the ideological traditions that we tease out in the book, that we write about, are things like racism, anti-immigrant extremism, and those, of course, go back to the very founding of our country. I think one of the accomplishments of our book is that we take a lot of moments and acts of violence and individuals who people in our country remember, people recognize, but have perhaps never been able to really weave into one coherent narrative, have really been able to kind of put together in one story. So we trace the trajectory from the founding of the Ku Klux Klan in the aftermath of the Civil War among white supremacist insurrectionists, through incidents like the 2015 Charleston church shooting, through January 6th, teasing out the various angles, the various themes, the tactical, strategic, ideological patterns, and identifying one through line. I think that's an achievement of ours, and that's what I'm most proud of in our work.
We have about 2 more minutes with this question. Can you speak a little bit about the relationship with mainstream politics and these far-right terrorists?
One of the themes, of course, is the relationship that this movement has had with politics, especially with elections. And one of the more concerning developments over the last few years of our narrative is the way in which different presidents were affected by and empowered or weaponized the movement that we write about. So, for example, after the Oklahoma City bombings of 1995, the movement suffered a bit of a collapse amid government pressure. It reawakened in 2008 when the United States elected its first black president. Barack Obama faced tremendous pressure, violence from the violent far right, and that was that characterized parts of his administration. President Trump capitalized on that movement, emerging onto the political stage with on a wave of, what you might call racist or divisive language, of course, rhetoric like Mexicans are rapists and criminals. And elements of the violent far right really felt like they had an ally in the White House. And then Joe Biden, of course, emerged as president in the aftermath of January 6th, arguably the most consequential incident in our book. And so this movement has always had a close relationship with the political system. And I think you've really felt that, especially over the past 20 years.
Let's move on to our second question. A major factor driving far-right sentiment is the development of new ways to get the message out. Tell us more about the importance of communication technologies, and especially social media, over the past few decades.
To my mind, that's actually one of the most interesting aspects of the book, is when we look at the landscape of terrorism over the past 25 years in this century, for example. We see the power of social media and how digital communications have been harnessed and exploited by terrorists as a means of radicalization and recruitment. And what Jacob and I show clearly in the book is that even though many people assume that this is a much more recent phenomena and centers more in the perennially violent Middle East from Islamist terrorist groups, in point of fact, it originated in the United States over 40 years ago, in the early 1980s, when white supremacists in the US were seeking to build a network of like-minded hate mongers, racists, anti-Semites, tax resistors, anti-government extremists, survivalists, and so on. And what they found is that they were constantly being infiltrated by the FBI, for example. Their communications over telephones, for example, or through the US mail were being intercepted. It's a federal offense in the United States to send hate mail internationally. And this was always a movement that aspired to have international connectivity. So they were especially keen back in the 1980s to spread their hate propaganda to Canada, in fact, and also to West Germany. And they were being arrested on federal postal charges. And then a figure that appears throughout our book, not least because he was also the creator of the strategy of leaderless resistance or lone wolf attacks, Louis Beam, had the idea of seizing upon what was then a very new and novel technology, and that was desktop computers that roughly had about 48K memory, which is probably a single letter or number on a PowerPoint slide, and hooking that up to something called modems. So you have to go back to that film, You've Got Mail, with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, where you actually used a phone to dial into a computer network, and you had this weird sound that initiated the connection, and began communicating in that manner, and began using what was then very basic computer hardware and software to knit together, firstly a national, and then they aspired to knit together or create a global network. It didn't succeed, but that jumping off platform of radicalization and recruitment we've seen consistently harnessed, from the progress of dial-up modems to the World Wide Web to the internet, and more recently to social media, which has really been weaponized by extremists on both ends of the ideological spectrum, but especially became very prominent and very effective in the far right's use of mobilization from the time President Obama was elected. I mean, right there, in 2008, you have that confluence of social media, and then the first African-American president being elected. And you have online sites like Stormfront that literally are almost collapsing because so many people are logging on to those websites for their messages. And of course, then the subsequent advent within the next 5 or 6 years of social media empowered them further.
We have about 90 more seconds for this question. Did you want to add anything, Jacob?
I do. I think social media has really served to lower the barriers to entry to extremism. And so over the past 10, 15 years, one of the developments that we've noticed is it seems like what you might call personal grievances or vulnerabilities or susceptibilities to extremism, whether that's a history of mental illness or romantic frustration or loneliness, isolation and bullying, or violence in the home or other kinds of traumas, are playing a greater role. And that seems to be because these vulnerable people receive extreme content through social media. It can obviate previous guardrails that we had in society and project straight into somebody's living room or bedroom and begin the radicalization process. That's a very powerful force. And if you'll just allow me, Pavan, to jump beyond the end of our book and look at 2025, I think you're seeing this more clearly than ever, with a number of incidents here in the United States involving people clearly radicalized on social media, conducting attacks that are attempting to appeal to some kind of online horde. But moreover, the government here in the US, the FBI has recently introduced a new category of extremism called nihilistic violent extremism, which involves individuals who appear to be driven more by a hatred of society, misandry than any kind of concrete political, at least partisan end goal. And these networks are really sustained online. The groups exist online, and it becomes tremendously challenging to predict and interdict when those networks break off that online space and emerge offline at locations where they commit attacks.
Let's move on to our third question. Ironically, a significant recruiting ground for those with anti-democratic views is the military and law enforcement. Can you explain why so many soldiers and police officers are joining the far-right movement?
It was really quite stunning for me as we wrote the book, but really when we concluded it, to read through the manuscript and see quite how many individuals were involved in this movement who came from a military background. Really at every stage, going from the origins of the Ku Klux Klan, of course, through post-World War II movements, through post-Vietnam movements, and now, of course, in the aftermath of the war on terror. There are really three ways in which this functions. First, you have individuals who are radicalized before they join the military, so they're actually entering the military to seek out training, expertise, because they want to use it for the movement. You have people who radicalize inside the military because of military culture. We find that to be more rare. And then you have the third category, which is people who radicalize after their service, when they're veterans, either because they're struggling to reintegrate, or they're dealing with some kind of trauma or injury-induced substance abuse. Each of these pose individual threats. Each of them are unique challenges. Obviously, the deadliest domestic terrorist incident in US history, the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, 30 years ago, was perpetrated by one military veteran, a very decorated Gulf War veteran, along with his two Army buddies who played smaller roles. But I would also point to the 2012, I believe, Sikh temple shooting in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, perpetrated by a military veteran who, by all accounts, according to his Army buddies, had radicalized during his service. It is a theme. It is a challenge. It's very controversial to discuss. And Bruce and I try and approach it in ways that are delicate and try to make realistic recommendations in terms of what the military could do to be part of the solution, not necessarily part of the problem. Bruce, did you have anything to add?
Well, firstly, I would say both Jacob and I recognize that it's only a very small percentage and a small number of serving or veterans of the United States military that have drifted into extremism. But as Jacob described, it is significant to trace the historical lineage of the military's connection with, or at least military veterans' connection with the far-right extremist movement. As we argue in the book, one of the founding fathers of this modern movement, who's not someone who's a household name by any stretch of the imagination, is William Potter Dale, who served in the United States military, was on General MacArthur's staff during World War II as an expert in counterinsurgency warfare, and really laid the foundations of the militia movement and had in his mind creating a fusion between, let's say, militia movement people who had an unswerving commitment to this, preserving the Second Amendment, for example, who also may have been survivalists, but combining them with racism, anti-Semitism, ultimately tax resistance and anti-federalism and sedition. The Reverend Richard Gurn Butler, who was the founder and leader of the Aryan Nations, was a decorated war hero from World War II. And of course, figures that we talk about in the book, like Randy Weaver, who played a huge role in the infusion of militancy in that movement in the early 1990s, as well as Timothy McVeigh, like Jacob just described, all had military backgrounds. I would say it's more common in the United States to find extremism on the far right in the US military than on the far left, but it's not non-existent. It's just more prevalent amongst far right extremism.
Just one very quick point. One of our most prominent groups, far-right terrorist organizations here in the United States over the past decade or so, is a group called The Base, which was involved in, it had several cells in the Deep South and in Maryland. And one of their most prominent members, you may remember, was a Canadian reservist who deserted, crossed the northern border illegally, and ended up playing a big role in training members of that group. He was eventually arrested in Maryland for plotting a significant far-right attack in Virginia a couple of years ago, Patrick Matthews. So this has ensnared the Canadian military as well, of course.
And the Hoffman, of course, which is designated by Canada as a U.S. terrorist organization, also had a large number of former military service personnel.
Let's move on to our fourth question. The chapter titled Leaderless Resistance was the most chilling, as it details the violence of lone wolves. Help us understand the danger that single individuals pose and the difficulty in stopping them.
Well, we have to start by unfortunately giving credit to the individual Bruce mentioned earlier, Louis Beam, who not only was the real driving force behind the violent far right developing its online profile, but also penned an essay twice titled Leaderless Resistance, which became a real strategic weapon, a strategic tool for the violent far right. In fact, I suspect Bruce and I would both probably agree that the two most important developments in 21st century terrorism would be social media radicalization and lone actor terrorism. Both of those tools have really been employed by basically every extremist ideology, from far left to far right to jihadist. But they both were really initiated by the violent far right in the 70s and 80s, as Bruce and I trace. Lone actor terrorism and leaderless resistance is really it's really a counterintelligence measure in my mind. So what you're trying to accomplish is to avoid government scrutiny, avoid government interference and intervention, but you're also trying to limit the effects, the damage of any one intervention. So the concept is if you gather in hierarchical organizations, if you gather with bureaucracy, with finances, with leadership, you leave yourself vulnerable. And of course, that was a lesson that the violent far right took from several government actions, operations that disrupted groups in earlier generations. The concept then says leaderless resistance allows you to gather in small cells or as individuals, stay dormant, remain under a government radar until the time comes to strike. Now, whether individual actors have deliberately employed this strategy or not, lone actor terrorism has really defined the violent far right threat in the past 30 years, coming from Timothy McVeigh's attack on Oklahoma City, all the way through all the incidents that we could discuss. Charleston in 2015, Oslo in 2011, Pittsburgh 2018, Christchurch 2019, Buffalo 2022, and beyond. Worth noting, of course, the most prominent far-right attack in Canada, which occurred in January 2017 in Quebec City, was also a lone actor attack. It makes government interdiction tremendously challenging because really you're looking for a needle in the haystack. These online forums that are radicalizing these individuals are frequently very violent spaces. They are spaces where everybody's engaged in violent rhetoric, in threatening language. And your job as a counterterrorism official is to identify the one or two people who are actually being serious in their conversations, the one or two people who are actually seriously mobilizing to violence. And that's a tremendously challenging thing to do. Really, the only measure that we have as a society, the main way that we try to counter lone act of violence, is through the much vaunted see something, say something strategy. Now, in a lot of cases after lone act of terrorism, individuals say, I knew something was happening. I knew something was up with this person. And it's really important that people do mention that to authorities. The flip side of that is in some cases, like the recent Charlie Kirk assassination, we really have no idea that somebody's plotting this kind of incident. And so counterterrorism, frankly, becomes impossible in those environments.
Let's finish with our last question. The book concludes with a play-by-play of the radical events of January 6, 2021. What are your recommendations for public leaders to consider in ensuring that the far right is neutralized so they don't get a second chance?
Well, don't forget, we started writing this book in 2020 at the beginning of the COVID lockdown, when conspiracy theories were becoming rampant across social media and the internet, and we saw sequentially various groups being blamed for the pandemic. We finished writing it in the summer of 2022. I'm tempted to say, and I think Jacob would agree with me, is we're in a completely different era now. I mean, when the book was published, because we both work at the Council on the Foreign Relations, and the Council is a nonpartisan entity, we went up to Capitol Hill and met with members of Congress on both sides. And we had an audience with both sides. Admittedly, it was more Democrats than Republicans, but we did speak with Republicans as well. I wonder if that could be replicated now, whether both sides would agree to meet with us, even if they'd want to talk about a book that had anything to do with far-right violent extremism. Now, there's been a shift in attention to far-left extremism, which I'm not entirely convinced is actually the right categorization. I see it more as the FBI's latest category of domestic terrorist adversary, which is nihilistic violent extremism, that it doesn't conform to stereotypical right-left, conservative liberal politics. But the point I want to make is that the largest chapter in our book was the policy recommendations. And I think given this current Congress and administration, it would be very difficult for any of them to be implemented right now. Jacob and I, at the time we were writing this, were much more positive than optimistic.
We divide our recommendations into three sections, sorry. The first is immediate term policies that you would implement now. That's largely legal issues. So, for example, we do talk about gun control, certain measures of that. We talk about social media regulation. The second element is medium-term policies. That's really about building resilience in society through counter-violent extremism programming, trying to counter the power of radicalization at the grassroots level. The third, and by far the most idealistic, I think, is a question of national unity. And we admit openly that trying to build national unity in our country is going to be a long-term struggle. And our goal was that the policies we outlined before that could have led us towards that direction. But I have to say, because you opened the question talking about January 6th, the January 6th investigation was the largest investigation in FBI history, over 1,500 prosecutions. And days into the second Trump administration, all that work was undone with a flourish of a pen. And so the first counterterrorism recommendation that Bruce and I would have made on January 20th, 2025, most likely would have been don't pardon the January 6th defendants. That, of course, was not followed through. And so we are in a new era. We are in an era where political violence is no longer seen as taboo, as illegitimate, even as criminal. And I think we're all just kind of waking up to that reality and having to rethink what it's going to mean to conduct counterterrorism in this environment.
We have about a minute more with this question. How do we hold those responsible for far-right terrorism accountable if they're just being pardoned?
Well, this I think is a much bigger problem, is that terrorism is becoming much more accepted and much more tolerated in the United States. And it's shifted from actually examining the act of violence itself or the tactic to looking at the background or the justification or the rationale or the explanation. And this has resulted in creating even more of a divide between right and left, is that acts of violence that may be non-lethal still are terrorism, but there's often a denial that they're terrorism. Then on top of that, when you pardon people, in many cases guilty of very serious crimes, assaulting a federal officer, for example, seditious conspiracy, the most serious charge in the United States, conspiring to overthrow the government, and they're pardoned or their sentences are commuted and this slate's wiped clean, well, what sort of deterrence is left?
Bruce, Jacob, that has been our 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Let's move on to our bonus questions. Bruce, Jacob, I'm curious about your career trajectory. How did you end up wanting to study far-right terrorism?
Well, I've been studying terrorism now for 49 years. And in the early 1980s, when I was a callow young analyst, one of the first accounts that I was given, it was one of the only ones that were left. All the more active terrorist movements of the 1980s had been taken by my colleagues. So by default, I chose far-right terrorism initially in Europe, but then I began to understand by 1983 and 1984 there was a problem in the United States as well. So this is something I have periodically studied very intensely in the 1980s and 1990s until the 9/11 attacks. And like almost every other terrorism analyst was laser focused on Al Qaeda and ISIS. But then Jacob and I returned to it, as I said, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic.
I would, when I was 16 years old in 2011, there was a devastating terrorist attack in Norway where 77 people were killed, most of them children who were my age at the time. And that really affected me. I like to say if you walk around DC, around our national security agencies, our city is full of people who tell the same story about 9/11 and about how that drove their desire to work in this field. That wasn't the case for me. For me, it was an incident of far-right terrorism, of white supremacy that drove my passion and inspired me to work on this. And then when I started my professional career a few years ago, I was given the tremendous opportunity, the great fortune to work under one of the true pioneers of the field of terrorism studies, who had studied this work for 40 years plus longer than I had, and that is of course Bruce Hoffman. And from then I've been stuck, unable to wriggle out from underneath his imposing shadow. But I'm proud of the work that we've done, and hopefully it does some good somewhere.
Yeah, just very, very quickly, I think one of the really fascinating dimensions of the book, and I think one of the book's strengths, is that Jacob and I are 40 years apart in age. And we brought two very different perspectives to the book that I think really enriched the book and made it quite unique. I mean, it's very rare that you have authors with that kind of divide on an issue. I mean, face it, the 21st century has seen this proliferation of social media. And Jacob's going to understand that, having been born in that generation, much better than, someone like my age. So and I had the historical perspective. So that emerged as, I think, one of the really important dimensions of the book.
Final question for you. What are you working on next? Do you have a project in mind?
I am writing the 4th edition of Inside Terrorism. It's a book that was first published in 1998. It has not gone out of print. There have been 3 editions of it, and frankly, so much has changed in the past decade, but less than a decade since the 3rd edition came out, that it really is a major rewrite. It's not just an updating, and I'm nearly finished with it, so hopefully it'll be published in the beginning of 2027.
I'm trying to get my head around two of the significant trends that have emerged in the past 5 years or so. I think both very chaotic, I think both very consequential. One of those is youth radicalization, which is a challenge that we identify somewhat in our book, but has really catapulted forward and is now a significant challenge in national security. The second is this issue that both Bruce and I discussed, the question of nihilism in violent extremism and the role that a desire for violence rather than ideological pursuit is now playing in terrorism, which is a change from previous eras. So trying to understand youth radicalization and nihilism and how they're changing this landscape.
Jacob Bruce, thank you so much for joining us on Books in 5. Again, the title of the book is God, Guns, and Sedition. If you're not able to buy it, definitely check it out from your local library because it is a necessary read in the times that we're living in. Jacob Bruce, you're active on social media, right? Where can people find you?
Twitter and Blue Sky.
Exactly.
Amazing. Jacob Bruce, thanks for joining us on Books in 5.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The host of Books in 5 is Bhavan Sodhan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.